My name is Sharon. I'm one of the pastors here at Bright City, and I wanted to add just a note about one of the announcements that Ike mentioned, this back to school blessing. One thing that we also wanted you to know, if you have kids in Kid City, is that this will be Sydney's, our Kid City director, that will be her last major event before she steps down from the position to have her baby. And so I know that it's actually very important for her to be able to pray over your kids and to commission them into the school year. And we thought it would also just be a very sweet way for your kids to kind of say goodbye, even though Sydney isn't going anywhere. Her time as the director is coming to an end. And so it's going to be a really special night for that reason as well. And so we just wanted you to have that information in addition to everything that Ike shared. Well, I am going to dive right in because I have a lot to get into this morning, and we have a very busy morning because we have our baptisms. But when we look back at the last 100 years, specifically at the 20th century, and we remember during that time who were the most notable leaders, the most notable revolutionaries, specifically as pertaining to the civil rights movement worldwide. One of those most remembered leaders is without a doubt Nelson Mandela. And I'm going to put up a picture of him. For those of you younger people, if you're my age or older, you remember very well the way that he impacted the world. But if you are younger and need a little bit of an education on this great man's legacy, the reason Nelson Mandela is and was so important is that he was elected in 1994 as the first ever president of the Democratic South Africa. Now, there had been presidents of South Africa before, but that had been during this system of apartheid. Apartheid is a word that literally means apartness. And it refers to this racist system in which the people of color, namely Black South Africans, were oppressed, they were segregated, they were also denied the right to vote. And so even though the country had presidents, they were never fairly elected until that system was overturned, and Nelson Mandela was the first president elected as a democracy. So he was significant for that reason. He was also the first Black head of state. And because of this work, in addition to helping to overturn the system of apartheid, because of these many accomplishments, Mandela was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I have another picture of him receiving this award. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The United Nations actually declared his birthday to be an international day of recognition. South Africa now remembers him as a father of their nation, and globally, he is remembered as one of the foremost democratic heroes of the 20th century, compared to the likes of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. So this towering figure in the world's history. That said, there is one aspect of Mandela's story that is unique and honestly so interesting, which is that his influence grew the most, his worldwide influence grew the most while he was serving a life sentence in prison. In 1964, Mandela was arrested and imprisoned for his opposition to the apartheid system at the time. And he was sentenced to life in prison. He ultimately did not serve life. He served 27 years, still just a crazy amount of time to be in prison. But this was an abrupt halt to his ascendancy as a leader in in the civil rights movement in South Africa. And because of this major obstacle, his imprisonment initially launched him into an incredibly dark time in his life. And I wanted to put up a picture of you for you to see his prison cell. So this is the amount of space. He slept for a long time on the floor. This is where he spent decades of his life. And I want you to just keep this slide up here for a second, because during this time, while he was in this cell, his mother died. His young adult son died in a car accident, and so he wasn't able to attend either one of their funerals. He was subjected to, when he was let out of this cell, he was subjected to just back-breaking labor outside that also permanently damaged his eyesight. He contracted numerous illnesses, including tuberculosis. And all of this led to periods of deep, deep depression. And while I mentioned that he ultimately did not serve a life sentence, he did serve nearly 30 years in prison. And so he lost, in addition to everything I just named, he lost all of his middle adult years. And yet, what's so fascinating about Mandela is that as he's written about this time in prison, when he wrote about it, when he spoke publicly about it, he later regarded his time in prison as having been instrumental to his formation as a leader. Mandela believed that this period in his life forged in him the skills, patience, and self-discipline that he needed to lead well. And in fact, his transformation in prison was so profound. He started to write, and he smuggled his writings out of prison. And so word sort of began to spread about this man, this imprisoned man. And so his reputation ultimately transcended the walls of his prison. And by the end of his prison term, he was regularly invited out to meet with South African politicians, including the Prime Minister. In other words, Mandela's decades in prison, hidden away from the public, cut off even from the news, did nothing to stop his leadership. And instead, he himself says, no, it refined it. And yet, that does not change the fact that there were many years when it did not feel that way, when he did not think it would end that way. There were many years when that prison cell felt like a barren, hopeless desert. Well, we are in the middle of a series called Summer in the Sand, when we are looking at different desert stories or wilderness stories in the Bible, stories of God calling people into the wilderness, or people simply finding themselves in the wilderness, and how these stories help us to journey through the deserts in our own lives. And for the past 2 weeks, as Ike mentioned and Evan mentioned, we looked at the Exodus story, when God delivered his people out of Egypt and into the wilderness for 40 years, and how confusing this time actually was for them. Ike preached about how these experiences shape our faith, how our own desert seasons, they distort our understanding of God, and they ultimately very often challenge our ability to trust him. But Ike also talked about how these stories teach us to remain resilient when we find ourselves in a similar place. Well, this morning we are moving out of this to look at another person in the Bible, a well-known figure in the Bible who spent his fair share of time in the wilderness, and that is David. Now, if you are not that familiar with the Bible, if you're somewhat new to church, most likely you have still heard of David at some point. Most likely the story that you have heard is the well-known story of David and Goliath. David killing this giant Goliath. This is my kids' one of their favorite stories in all of the Old Testament. And so David is well known for this. He is also well known for being the greatest king of Israel, and Jesus is ultimately born into the line of David. But what is fascinating about David, and one thing he holds in common with Nelson Mandela, is that his own formation as a leader was not a straight line. Instead, his leadership medal was forged in the same sort of arena as Mandela's, which is to say it was forged in the wilderness. And for David, it was literally the wilderness, because before David was king, he was a shepherd. He spent all of his young adulthood as a shepherd in the wilderness, tending sheep. And these wilderness years, these shepherd years, as I'm going to call them, prepared him to be the kind of king that Israel ultimately needed. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning, is the reality that the desert, that the wilderness, these seasons that we experience, they are not just a time of wandering. They are not just a time of disorientation, but your wilderness seasons are also a time of preparation. That very often in those seasons of hiddenness and waiting or hardship, God is preparing us for something ahead if we are willing to receive it. And so this morning, we're going to look at 4 different ways that God prepares us in our wilderness seasons by looking at how God used David's shepherd years to prepare him. And we're going to do that by starting in 1 Samuel 16 with the very little that we know about David's shepherd years. Just to give you a little bit of context before I read this passage, where we find ourselves in 1 Samuel 16 is that God has rejected Saul as king, and he has sent the prophet Samuel on this mission of finding the next king. And so Samuel arrives at the doorstep of this man named Jesse, who has all of these sons. And so he goes and he inspects all of these young men. And after looking at each one, he declares, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." And so here is what happens next in 1 Samuel 16, verse 11. It says, Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" And he says, "There's still the youngest," he answered, "but right now he's tending the sheep." Samuel told Jesse, "Send for him. We won't sit down to eat until he gets here." So Jesse sent for him. He had beautiful eyes and a healthy, handsome appearance. Then the Lord said, "Anoint him, for he is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David from that day forward. So initially, this is all that we are told about David's shepherd years. We know that it was pretty typical for the youngest son to be the shepherd. And so that's why he was the one as the youngest son out in the field tending sheep. But because of this, probably because of his age, because of his lack of life experience as well, his own father did not consider him to be a contender for this role as the future king. But what his own father did not yet understand was that it was precisely David's work as a shepherd that was preparing him for leadership. How do we know this? Because David later tells us so. When we turn to the next chapter, chapter 17, that's where we read this famous story of David and Goliath, in which this Philistine giant is walking around and he's taunting Israel, and he's saying, "Send me your bravest, your mightiest warrior, and if he can defeat me, we will subject ourselves to you. But if I defeat him, you must serve us." And for 40 days, he does this. And for 40 days, all of Israel's bravest men, their most highly trained warriors, they cower in fear. And that is when David, the shepherd boy, arrives on the scene, and he offers to fight Goliath. And King Saul, you can almost imagine him sort of patting David on the head and saying, "Aren't you so adorable? Like, you don't understand what you are saying right now. And so this is what happens next in 1 Samuel 17:34. It says, Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it and struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth, which is like pretty legit, you guys. Like, I don't know who else in this room. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So in this moment, David is reminding Saul, when you see me, you think that what my job description is, what my resume is, that I just sit on a field playing a harp, singing Kumbaya while sheep serenely roam around. You're forgetting my actual resume, that I have to fight wild beasts to protect my sheep. And so in other words, David is saying to him, I have trained for this exact moment. And then when he enters the battlefield, David walks the talk. He kills Goliath the way he would have killed a bear, which is to say, not with a warrior's sword, but with the sling and stone of a shepherd. Of course, in all of those years of fending off wild animals, David could not have known that that was a skill he was developing that he would need in actual battle. But it brings us to the first thing that the wilderness develops in us, that it equips us with, which is ability. Ability. Sometimes when we are in seasons when we feel stuck, where we feel like we're going in circles, where life isn't moving forward, what is actually happening is we are being trained. The wilderness is where God is equipping us with skills we will need in the future. And the most obvious example of this is actually school. We have so many students in this room who are either in middle school or high school or college or graduate school. And for some of you, if you are being honest, school feels like a desert. You feel stuck. You feel like you're learning things that, what does algebra possibly have to do with real life? Like, why do I have to learn how to write an essay? Or maybe you're in graduate school and you understand why these skills matter, but you're also kind of chomping at the bit to get started, to jump in for life to begin. But it's important to remember that these concepts that you are learning, these skills that you are acquiring, specifically of study, of communicating, of problem solving, these are all skills that you will need later on regardless of your job. That said, the wilderness can also equip us in really surprising ways as well. As I already mentioned, David, as he's honing his craft as a shepherd, as he's learning to protect these sheep, he's not thinking, I'm ultimately going to use this in actual battle. But going back to the story of Nelson Mandela, one skill that he picked up in prison was learning the language of Afrikaans, which was the language of his prison guards. One thing that is really interesting is at that time, many Black South Africans, they resisted learning Afrikaans because they believed it was the language of the oppressor. But Mandela realized I literally cannot communicate with my prison guards. I can't advocate for myself. I can't advocate for my fellow prisoners. And so he learned the language. Again, this feels like a very practical skill that he is acquiring. However, this skill eventually shaped him as a leader in deeper ways, because he realized that if he wanted to influence the people who held power, he needed to understand them, both literally and figuratively. He later said of how this season shaped him, he said, if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. And so this practical skill, this ability that he developed in his own desert season, it translated into a larger philosophy that would come to characterize his negotiations with the existing government. It also helped him to lead the entire nation of South Africa towards reconciliation instead of this cycle of retaliation. All of which is to say, if you are in a season where you feel stuck or you don't know where you are going or what God is doing, I want to challenge you, don't just ride it out. Don't just bide your time until it's over. I want you to consider what tools God is adding to your tool belt, what skills. And how can you commit yourself to developing those abilities well, because you just don't know how God might use them. Amen? That's the first thing that God equips us with, the way that he prepares us in the wilderness is ability. The second thing that God prepares us with, that he equips us with, is honestly really similar to the first, but it's different enough that I wanted to give it its own point, which is that in addition to ability, God also equips us with capacity. Our desert seasons don't simply equip us with skills, but they also invest us with increased bandwidth for managing more and an increased tolerance for challenge, difficulty, confusion, or even pain. Going back to the example of school, one thing that often intimidates my younger kids is when they see the amount of schoolwork that their older brother has. And they look at all the time he has to spend at night working, and they say, I could never do that. That's so much. And I remind them, like, you're not there yet. You don't have to do that. It's not as if you graduate from elementary school and they just drop you off a cliff and now you have like 10 hours of homework at night. No, the way that school works is they slowly increase the capacity of students so that they can handle more and more. This is an essential attribute of challenge, of wilderness, is building our capacity. We also experience this growing of capacity when we have children. I remember when Ike and I first had Isaac, it was really all we could do to leave the house. Like going to Target felt like climbing Mount Everest. But by the time we had our third child, we were planting a church. Like it was no big deal. Because capacity is something that you grow. And I will tell you that this is a principle that I have had to keep in mind many times, because years ago, when we had first planted Bright City, there was a young, sweet college student who suggested to me and Ike that college students actually have a lot more going on than anybody else. And I wanted to take this person's face in my hands and say, I want you to look me in the eye with my 3 children, my church plant that I'm leading, my second book that I am finishing, and I want you to say that to my face one more time. But all that to say, it has helped me to have compassion, to have understanding, to remember that capacity is something that we grow over time, and we grow it through difficulty. In fact, one of the capacities that we often grow in the wilderness is for the wilderness itself. Because going back to David and his shepherd years, we remember that this was not the only time that he spent in the wilderness. We will actually get to this next Sunday. But before David would become king, Saul would ultimately start to pursue him, to kill him. And so David had to go back into the wilderness. And what we see during that time is that he had been trained for this time, that he had learned to tolerate, to endure, and even remain faithful to God in the wilderness because of his previous years that had already formed him for it. And one of the reasons we know this is we read the Psalms that David wrote in that wilderness season. This is a man who had learned to navigate the wilderness by running to God. And so again, if you find yourself in a challenging season, a season of wilderness, I wonder what capacity God might be developing in you for the future. That's number 2. As we look again at David's story, we see, though, that his ability and his capacity are not the only things that God developed in him during his shepherd years. We also see that God used those shepherd years to develop his character. You know, the most obvious way we see this is his willingness to fight Goliath when no one else would. Life as a shepherd had taught him to be brave. It had formed him into this man of courage. But there's another exchange between David and Saul prior to him going out into the battlefield that I've always loved because I think it displays his character in a really special way. Just before David leaves to fight Goliath, Saul actually offers David his own armor to wear for protection. And I want to read you David's response to Saul in this moment. This is 1 Samuel 17:38. It says, "Then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. 'I can't walk in these,' David said to Saul. 'I'm not used to them.'" Also, I just love the redundancy in scripture sometimes where it's like he couldn't walk in them because he wasn't used to them. And then it quotes him saying, "I'm not used to them." Anyway, every time I read this, it just made me laugh. Editors would hate that. So David took them off. Instead, he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So we have this moment where Saul is going to David and saying, okay, at the very least, please wear my armor. And honestly, this probably would have felt like an enormous honor that the king of Israel is offering his armor to you. And yet David puts it on and he realizes this isn't me. This doesn't fit me. It literally doesn't fit me, but it also doesn't fit who I am. I'm not a warrior. I am a shepherd. And I've always been struck by this moment because I think it points to one way that David had been formed during those shepherd years out in the wilderness alone, just serving God and these sheep, is that during that time he had developed this unusually clear sense of self. He knows who he is and he knows who he is not. He is not a warrior king, he is a shepherd. And what's especially impressive about this, that is so unusual, especially for a young person, is that he clearly is not interested in fitting into some particular image that people would expect of a soldier. This absence of striving or trying to be someone that God has not called him to be, it continually defines David's character. Later on, when David has the opportunity to kill Saul, he resists, knowing this isn't who God called me to be or how God called me to take power. And so this integrity, this confidence, this deep sense of self, I believe, can be credited to an aspect of the desert that is less obvious, but very powerful. And that is the hiddenness of it. Because the secret place is where God often cultivates these deeper character qualities. As theologian Dallas Willard puts it, it is in seasons of hiddenness that we experience our continuing relationship with God in independence from the opinions of others. That's what we're seeing in this moment. Because in seasons of waiting, hiddenness, and obscurity, which is what David experienced, God can prune and purify our motives because we're learning to be motivated by no one but Him. That is the unique opportunity of these desert seasons in our lives. And it's something that Nelson Mandela credited as well, the hiddenness of being in a prison cell. He says that this season of being in this cell, it not only purified his motives, but it also forced him to turn inward. He says the cell is an ideal place to know yourself. People tend to measure themselves by external accomplishments, but jail, or one might say the desert, the wilderness, allows a person to focus on internal ones, such as honesty, sincerity, simplicity, humility, generosity, and an absence of variety. You learn to look into yourself. And so if you are in a desert season, if you are in a wilderness season that is characterized by that hiddenness, maybe you are starting out in a job or in a career where you are at the bottom of the ladder. And so people do not acknowledge your gifts. They don't care about your diploma. You are having to make coffee. You are having to do menial tasks. Maybe you have had to step away from work to be at home with your kids. Maybe you're on the opposite side of the spectrum where you are spending a lot of your days caregiving for older parents, and so you aren't able to work or socialize like you used to. Or maybe your wilderness involves something other than hiddenness, but these challenges are an opportunity for God to do a deeper work in you, to develop your character if you are willing to invite Him in. Right now, what aspect of your character might God be wanting to develop in you? Maybe you have been bitter or cynical or angry, and God's putting His finger and saying, that's actually something that I would like to change in you, transform in you. So that's the third thing that God develops in us in the wilderness. And then the fourth and final is that in the wilderness, God develops in us not just ability, not just capacity, not just character, but finally, calling. One of the things that struck me this week as I was studying this story, this very familiar story, was something that I had never noticed before. You see, one reason that David is remembered as having been really special is that God Himself describes David as a man after His own heart. What a thing for God to say about a person. And for a really long time, I thought this was a commentary on the depth of David's faith, maybe his humility before the Lord. I think that all of that is true. But this week, as I was meditating on the significance of David's shepherd years, it struck me how often God refers to Himself as a shepherd. And that's when I realized that when God is describing David as a man after His own heart, I'm wondering if He's looking at David as a man who is more shepherd than king. Maybe God was looking for a man who would not lead as other worldly kings did by serving themselves or amassing power, but would lead with selfless courage and tenderness and humble care the way that a shepherd would. When we hear those words, a man after God's own heart, through that lens, we realize that David's shepherd years were not a detour from his calling, but instead the birthplace of it. His shepherd years prepared him to be the exact kind of leader God desired all along. This was, of course, also true, going back one last time to the story of Nelson Mandela. He would reflect that his wilderness years prepared him for his ultimate calling in ways that instant success could never have done. And so my final question for you this morning is whether your wilderness might be a birthplace of your calling. Perhaps you are a student who feels like school is, in fact, a desert. But I want to challenge you that what you are learning, what you are developing, especially as you do discover your gifts and your passions, maybe ones that you didn't even know you had, I want you to pay attention to them. I want you to devote yourself to developing them, because God might also be, through this journey, developing your calling. Maybe your wilderness is a cancer journey. Maybe it is a chronic illness journey. Maybe it's the loss that you experience in divorce or the pain of singleness. Maybe it's the premature death of someone that you love. Maybe you have battled addiction to substances, to pornography. Maybe you are in the middle of a heartbreak, but whatever your story is, the struggle that you are engaged in, that you have engaged in, I want you to know that struggle is forging something in you that is not just for you. It is for the love of others and the glory of God. So make sure that your eyes are not so fixated on the wilderness that you forget to look up. As we close this morning, one final thing that I do want to mention, especially for those of you, if you are in the middle of the wilderness right now, and you're hearing everything I'm saying and you're thinking, like, that's all well and good, I'm encouraged to know that God might redeem this season, but I'm also not there yet. Like, I can barely get out of bed right now. If that's you, I want to remind you that one of the things that we also remember when we tell David's story is that even though God called him to be this shepherd king, that David ultimately could not be the shepherd that Israel needed. He could not be the shepherd that the world needed. David ultimately failed. And so that is why Jesus came and did what David could not do. This is how Jesus describes himself in John 10. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And so my reminder to you is that to follow Jesus is to know that we are never in the wilderness alone. That it is not your job to guide yourself, to be your own shepherd. You already have a good shepherd who wants to protect you, to grab you out of the lion's mouth, to deliver you, to care for you, to nourish you. In just a moment, we are going to celebrate the baptism of one of our students who recognized the good news of this good shepherd. That when we invite this good shepherd into our lives, we do not walk the wilderness alone. But right now, before we turn to baptism, I want to give you a little bit of time to reflect on where this message meets you. Whether you are in a season where God has put his finger on one of these 4 things and saying that this is actually something that I'm developing you. I want to develop in you. Or maybe you are someone who is recognizing, I need the good shepherd in my life. I have been walking alone and I don't want to walk alone anymore. If that's you, take this time to say yes to the good shepherd, to say yes